Refer, for instance, to the case of the pacemaker, in which, let's say, the biological part was still dominant over the mechanical incorporation. And I understood it that as you progress along the future, you would reach a stage where the human being could not be as recognizable as he is today.
I believe that will be true. I don't believe it's true now, but I think that we can...
The real cyborg, which would be a part human, and most of it machinery.
Well, except that when we say machinery, we think of big things. In fact, they may be minute.
Biological machinery.
Well, they may be biological, and they may be so tiny that you don't even recognize it's there. That is, we're going to nano-scale technologies. What is that? That's a billionth of a... So it's so tiny. And we have a lot of work going on, for example, in neuroscience, a study of the brain, and so forth. And I think that in 50 years, or perhaps 75 years, we will, in fact, regard it as routine to have implants of one kind or another in the body or on the body, and that we may very well, after a while, have to define what do we mean by human. How different can you be and still be regarded as human? There's a wonderful, wonderful book that we read years ago, and I've never forgotten. It's by a French author, probably now gone, named Vercors, V-E-R-C-O-R. And he wrote this book about an island in the Pacific on which they discovered a species of a creature that was like an ape, but much more intelligent. And he came to he visited that island and came to the conclusion that these creatures were essentially human. And came back to Australia, and the word got out. And the business guys said, oh, really, if that's smart, we can put them to work, and we don't have to pay them. So they, in fact, did. They went and brought some of these creatures and tried to essentially exploit them as free labor. But the original hero of the book said that they were human. And the other side said, no, they're not human, they're animals. He therefore took a baby from the species and took it with him to London. In London, he shot the baby and called the police and said, I have committed murder. And there then followed a trial in court in which the decision had to be made. Was that human or was that not human? It's a wonderful, wonderful story. A wonderful story. And it raises precisely this issue.
There's ethics, which it's an element that keeps on coming into your work throughout. And in the 70s, you brought about this question.
It's unfair. You have a different Alvin Toffler talking to this Alvin Toffler.
No, it's not really. It's my Alvin Toffler. and in my Alvin Toffler, you highlight this question that Nixon asked. At some stage, well, in the 70s, he was in power. He asked, "Who do we want to be as a nation?" Has this question been answered throughout the world? Are we? Is there a paradigm, a vision for mankind?
I think you're seeing
for humanity in general.
I think you're seeing the deliberate manipulation of nationalism in many countries. We saw it a year or two ago, and to some degree still in Japan, China, and we certainly are seeing it in Russia, where Heidi and I have just returned. And what you see is a country that went through a terrible crisis starting in the 90s, and where the entire economy broke down and the entire rigid system of the Soviet Union was gone, and the new leader comes in named Putin, and he has very little regard for what we would call democracy, but he is telling the Russian people that we are a great people, we have this long cultural history, we are a nation, and evinces nationalism. The question is, are nations still what we presume nations to be?
Are they?
I think less and less. First of all, there's more interaction between what we call nations, more and more economic, certainly economic interaction, but also political interactions and so on. And that nations are losing some of their relative power, not simply to each other. When we wrote that, you could say that one nation is gaining in power, another nation is losing power. What is happening, and has happened since, is that nations as such, nation states, are losing a degree of power to who? Other groups that operate at the international level. For example, multinational corporations are more and more powerful. They're not nations, but they're more and more powerful, and they affect nations, and sometimes are more powerful than small nations, and so on. So you have that. Then you have the rise of international NGOs, which are also exerting and pressuring nations about certain issues. They might be environmental, they might be something else. So what you have is we've gone from a world which, when we wrote Future Shock, was the case, in which essentially the only players on the global scale were nation states. But now there are other players at the international global level as well. And so relative to the past, nation states are no longer the sole players and have lost some of their power. And I think that that is going to continue to happen. And with the increasing spread of not just computers, but all of these other communication systems and networks of all kinds, that we see activities going on outside the frame, or even outside, in many cases, the control of nations.
Professor Toffler, your nation pretty soon will be called to take some dramatic decisions concerning its political future for at least in the next 4 years.
Yes.
You have one person of color, you have one woman, and you have one conservative. Now this is revolution in progress.
Yes.
Where does your heart lie?
Oh, it's very clear to me. First of all, let me say this. All politicians in campaigns make promises. I will change the health system. I will do this. I will do that. I will do the other thing. None of those promises can be expected to happen, at least in the way that they're presented. In order for an American president to accomplish the promise to change the health system, for example, they need to organize support from first of all, they need of course the support of Congress. Secondly, they need to deal with lobbyists who are putting money into the system from the outside to influence the direction of change. There are many constituencies and groups that are acting on each of these proposals that the nation, the national leader, whoever that is, has to take into account. So and the process by which this is done frequently takes long time. The result is that by the time you really have what we would call a bill, the circumstances that required it have probably changed somewhat. So I don't believe in the promises of any of the candidates.
You're going to vote?
And very often we haven't voted, but we will vote this time, and we will both vote for Obama. Now, the reason for that, again, therefore, is not because of what he says he will accomplish, but rather for a foreign policy reason, because I think a black American president will be a message to the world, a healthy, good message to the world.
And then again, it's a message to the future.
And a message to the future, yes. And so I think that I would very much like to have a black American president, once and for all, after all of the terrible history of our treatment of our black brothers.